This is part 7 of the Team Associated B5M Factory Lite build series. Basically, at this point, I have the electronics installed and everything is all set to go. So I'm just going to go over the electronics installation and just to give you a sense of what it was like. So take the body off here. Basically, it's a really tight fit. I was quite surprised. So the first thing I want to point out is with the battery mounted the way it is, with the ports either fully to the right or left side, depending on which way you mount your shorty pack, you have to mount or solder the wires onto the plug in such a way that they form an L shape like this. I'm not normally used to doing that. Usually I mount the wire directly in line with the plug. But with this body, the side pods sit kind of low. So when you actually mount the body, if the wires are in line with these plugs, the wires tend to stick up and it won't allow the body to fully mount. So you have to mount them, these plugs at an L shape. So that's one thing to point out. The actual bay in here that you get is supposed to be used for mounting the speed control and the receiver, but I run Spectrum receivers because I have a Spectrum module on my radio. These Spectrum receivers are a little on the large side, so there's no way that I could find to fit both the receiver and the speed control in this bay. You need a pretty small receiver to fit in here. So I just mounted the speed control kind of, in line with everything, and I put the receiver in here. So that required me to take out the foam spacers that come with the car that you would normally mount up front here. And I just did a kind of custom foam spacer bit. So I have another foam spacer over here that I cut out to pick up the slack between where the receiver is and all this gap over here. And then on this side here, I just mount the receiver kind of standing up like this with a little foam spacer in the back to pick up the slack between the receiver and the battery. That's the only way I could figure to get this to fit. So the problem here, of course, is if I want to move the battery around, say I wanted to move it forward, for example, I wouldn't be able to fit the receiver anywhere in order to accommodate that unless I move the battery all the way forward and move the receiver all the way to the back. But I don't anticipate really needing to move the battery around to change the weight distribution. I don't see that being a big deal. So I'm going to stick with this as it is where the receiver is, and we'll see how it goes. I had thought of putting the receiver here on top of the battery brace, but the body is kind of a cab forward body. So the receiver would actually be sitting like somewhere around here, and the body wouldn't be able to fully mount if I mounted the receiver here. So that's not an option either. The receiver has to go forward somewhere. You could maybe perhaps mount it on top of the servo that would fit, because that's kind of where the cabin is in the body. So that's another option, I suppose. But the wiring would get a little messy because all of these wires that plug into the receiver are now kind of bunched up this way. So you'd have to zip tie them down and sort of shove them back in this direction. You'd also need a place to mount your transponder, maybe on top of the receiver, which would be on top of the servo. That could be an option. So I would say that the electronics mounting in here is similarly tight as it is with the B5 rear motor. I was actually kind of surprised that there wasn't more space in here. Another thing to make note of is the space that you have to mount the servo. So let me get my little box here. So lately I've been playing around with these Trinergy Trackstar steering servos, and they're actually quite good in terms of the specifications. So this is the TS920 servo, and it's something like $30 to $35. But it has titanium gears and ball bearings and brushless motor, and the torque is something like at 6 volts, you get about 147 ounce-inches of standing torque and 129 ounce-inches of stall torque. And the transit time is 0.09 seconds at 6 volts. So this is a pretty solid steering servo, and it's like a little over $30. So I have a couple of Turnigy servos in some of my other cars, and they've worked very nicely. So I wanted to put it in here, but the problem is these Trackstar servos at least have a longer casing than, say, something like a high-tech servo or a Futaba servo that would normally fit in here. But because of the way that this sort of servo bay is put together, there's only so much space to fit both the servo and your electronics. And these two pieces here, the front and center piece, have this little plastic line that runs in between them. So you actually cannot fit those Turnigy servos in here. There's not enough space unless you cut out this little plastic bar, and that will allow the servo to push out a little bit. Two problems with that. First, you may lose some flex if you cut out this plastic bar, because it is part of the structure of the chassis. And also you would have less space to mount your speed control. I might not even be able to fit this speed control if I mounted that longer servo. And this, by the way, is a Turnigy Trackstar Turbo second generation speed control. I really like the speedo. It's really nice. So that's pretty much it. Other than that, everything seemed to go together okay as far as how I would rate the build. I wouldn't give it a 10 out of 10. There were a few complaints I had along the way, as I mentioned in the other videos. And again, the electronics mounting is really tight. So I think, it was okay. It was an okay build. I wonder if this is a trend that we're going to see with increasingly modern buggies, that the chassis itself leaves very little room to mount electronics, which basically means you're either forced to get creative with how you mount your older electronics, like these receivers, which are kind of old by now, or you're just forced to buy newer equipment and get these really tiny receivers to fit, in the chassis. I don't want to do that because I have a whole ton of cars that I run, and I really like running these Spectrum receivers. They're fairly inexpensive, so I'm just going to have to learn to live with it. Anyway, so this should complete the build series. I will be racing this car this weekend, so hopefully if things go well, I'll have some kind of a short-term review to give you for this. And in the meantime, thanks for watching.